more than 3 millennia ago, before dawn had even broken on the shores of the Mediterranean, an invisible storm roared, sweeping away the most brilliant civilizations of the world. Bronze Age. Close your eyes and listen to the story of the collapse of a once prosperous world, of the distant echoes of a mystery that still fascinates us today. The story of sea peoples. Cities that were once beacons of knowledge and commerce were reduced to ashes. Mighty kingdoms such as Egypt, Hittite, Mycenae, Good, Ugar. It suddenly disappeared as if it had never existed, leaving only in ancient records a haunting phrase: invaders from the sea. Who were they? Where did these mysterious warriors come from, carrying strange ships, never before seen, weapons, and a language no one understood? Their origins remain shrouded in a dense fog, their motives forever unanswered, and their true identities seem to have been purposefully erased from history. All we know are fragments from the civilizations that encountered them, and those who survived the nightmare they brought. Were they waves of desperate migrants seeking new lands, ruthless pirates spreading terror, or an organized force bent on overthrowing the entire world order? 3,000 years have passed. Archaeologists still persistently search for clues under the sands of time. Historians still debate. And somewhere in the silence of the long night, the truth about one of the greatest mysteries in human history is still hidden, inviting us to explore, to really feel the shock of the appearance of sea people. Scaused, we need to imagine a world before the storm. It was a Mediterranean, brilliant, an era of connected, prosperous, but also fragile, between the 14th and early 13th centuries BC. The civilizations in the region were not only economically and technologically advanced, but also closely interwoven through extensive trade and diplomatic network in the South New Kingdom of Egypt. Under the illustrious pharaohs such as Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, Seti. I was at the height of its power, with great temples towering along the banks of the Nile, testament to its boundless wealth and ambition. Egyptian merchant ships brought back precious cedar wood from Lebanon, synonym cypress, and exotic gems and spices from legendary lands. Punt. North, on the plateau, Anatolia Hittite Empire, mighty from the capital. Hattusa controlled strategic trade routes, were not only talented warriors but also outstanding diplomats, leaving behind a rich treasury of diplomatic correspondence. To the west, Mycenaean civilization dominated mainland Greece with fortified centers such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, powerful city-states with advanced metallurgy and nobles living in magnificent palaces. From Greece, Mycenaean merchant ships spread across the Mediterranean, trading wine, olive oil, pottery, and weapons. To the east, the port cities of Levant, like Ugarit, Byblos, play the role of indispensable links. In particular, Ugarit. Not only is it a shopping mall, but it is also the birthplace of the world's first real alphabet, the basis for many modern writing systems. What really held these civilizations together was not just military might or wealth, but a complex trade network spanning both sea and land routes. On large ships, essential materials especially, copper and tin blood vessels to create bronze constantly rotating. Archaeological discoveries, like shipwrecks in Uluburuof, the coast of Turkey with its treasure trove of goods from across the ancient world, is living testimony to the deep economic integration of the time. However, this very interdependence was a fatal weakness. When trade routes were disrupted, when one link in the chain broke, the entire system could collapse in a domino effect. Moreover, many civilizations, while seemingly powerful, were built on centralized and fragile power structure, vulnerable to sudden shocks. No one could have guessed that within a few decades, an alien force from the sea would shake this entire order to its core, triggering one of the greatest collapses in history. The heart of this prosperous world is a complex and extensive trade network, a system on which all civilizations depend, and the invisible thread that binds their fates. Imagine a ship leaving the port of Ugarit on a fine day. The deck is filled with crates copper precious from Cyprus, famous for its rich copper mines. Next to it are ingots rare, perhaps from Anatolia, the Caucasus, or even from the British Isles, requiring long and dangerous trade routes. Bronze. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the strategic material of the era, used to forge swords, spears, armor, agricultural, and construction tools. Without bronze, armies would lose their edge, craftsmen would be unable to produce goods, and both trade and manufacturing would stagnate. This was truly bloodline of the Bronze Age. This ship was not only carrying metal, it was also carrying cedar wood from Lebanon to build warships' palace beams, gold from Nubia gemstones from Sinai, aromatic resin from Arabian and rare purple dye. Ships like these connected Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, Greece, and the Aegean Islands. At Hattusa, the Hittites imported horses and tin, and exported wrought iron and textiles. At Mycenae, royal treasures containing artifacts from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Near East testify to a vibrant trading world. Each merchant, each ship, was a tiny link in this vast network, not only a conduit for goods, but also a conduit for ideas, technology, religion, and language. The Ugaritic alphabet, advanced metallurgy, and ancient myths all traveled the seas. Yet this deep dependence also made civilizations vulnerable. When tin supplies were blocked, when trade routes were cut off by pirates or war, the consequences were not just the loss of a commodity, but the potential collapse of the entire economic system. Modern scholars often compare the Bronze Age world to a form of eerily global economy. And like any global economy, it functions smoothly when all its parts are in harmony, but it is frighteningly fragile in the face of unexpected shocks. Few could have guessed that those shocks were already brewing, and that when they hit, the entire Bronze Age world order would collapse faster than anyone had thought. But no matter how skillful the ancient kings were, and how extensive the trade networks there were, still forces beyond human control. The first signs of a deep crisis began to appear quietly from within the nature. Modern climate research, synthesizing data from ancient ice cores, tree ring analysis, and lake-bottom sediments, reveals that in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, the Mediterranean and the Near East experienced a period of severe climate instability. Droughts lasting decades, even centuries, have devastated crops, especially in areas heavily dependent on agriculture, such as Canaan Levant and a part of it Upper Egypt. Tree ring studies from Anatolia show years of stunted trees clear evidence of prolonged water shortages. In an economy heavily dependent on agriculture and imported grain, the major kingdoms began to feel the strain. Food became scarce, prices soared, famine spread, and social unrest ensued. But nature's fury did not stop there. The strong earthquake confirmed by evidence of faulting collapsed key cities, such as Ugarit, Hattusa, Mycenae. The walls collapsed not because of battle, but because of the power of heaven and earth. In a world where the king's power was tied to his ability to protect his people from natural disasters, these disasters dealt a deep psychological blow. Beyond physical evidence, these remaining diplomatic letter offers a vivid glimpse into the desperate mood of the time. From clay tablets excavated at Ugarit, we read desperate pleas for help. Reports of food shortages, civil unrest, and a flood of migrants fleeing parched lands. These messages reveal a world fractured from within an interdependent system, now struggling to maintain stability. It is in this context, as food supplies dwindle, natural disasters strike, and social tensions simmer, that sea peoples will appear. But were they the cause of this collapse, or merely the inevitable result of a world that was already falling apart? That question, even today, remains unanswered. like a haunting whisper from the past. Perhaps the clearest picture of a world falling apart lies not in the cracks in the ground, but in the trembling words engraved on small clay tablets, the desperate letter exchanged between kings now excavated from the ruins of the city Ugarit. At that time, Ugarit was a bustling commercial center on the Levant coast, serving as an important crossroads in the region's economic network. The city was not only wealthy, but also remarkably advanced in administration and writing, where archaeologists have unearthed more than 1,000 inscribed clay tablets, recording transactions, treaties, and diplomatic correspondence. Among them are letters that still make readers shiver when they read them today. One letter sent by the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus while his enemies were besieging him reads, "The enemy is at the gates. My city is in dire straits. Send reinforcements and provisions immediately if possible. Otherwise, I fear Ugarit will not be able to hold out." These simple, desperate words reflect a world once accustomed to trade and diplomatic protocol, now plunged into a fight for survival. The letters also reveal the disruption of the trade system itself. In another message, the king of Ugarit complains that merchant ships are unable to dock because strange pirates have appeared off the coast, and laments that copper and tin, once reliably delivered, have failed to arrive. Taken together, these scattered details paint a picture of a once smooth regional economy, now at a standstill. And as trade routes were disrupted, military and food supplies across kingdoms quickly fell into crisis. What is particularly striking is how the tone of these letters changed over time. In the earlier tablets, one finds formal greetings, invitations to exchange gifts, negotiations for royal marriages, all reflecting a world of confident, prosperous rulers. But in the final letters from Ugarit, written just before the city was destroyed, that confidence was gone, replaced by panic, pleas for help, and utter fear. Kings, who had once considered themselves the pinnacle of power, were now reduced to writing desperate, vulnerable pleas like any ordinary person. And then one day, Ugarit falls. When archaeologists excavated the tablets, many of them were still lying on desks never sent. Those last letters unsent remain a living testament to a world in disintegration. In each line of the clay, we can still feel the breath of a dying era. And it was at this moment that sea peoples began to emerge from the shadows as agents, or perhaps as symbols of the end of a once glorious era. Just a few years before, desperate pleas for help were hastily etched into clay Mediterranean cities, were basking in rare prosperity. Ugarit not only was it a bustling seaport, it was also a major cultural center. In the houses of merchants and nobles, exquisite ceramics, gold and silver jewelry, and intricate carvings were displayed everywhere, demonstrating a wealthy class that loved beauty. Merchant ships constantly entered and exited the port, and the market was bustling with silk spices, colored glass, and precious metals from all over the world. Hattusa, the capital of Hittite Empire. Equally splendid with its massive temples and gates made of giant blocks of stone. In the west, the city-states Mycenae. There were magnificent palaces with vivid frescoes depicting hunting scenes, rituals, and daring sea voyages. Even ordinary citizens benefited from this globally connected economy. They wore better fabrics, used better household appliances, and had access to luxury items once reserved for the elite. What people felt most deeply was a deep belief in the stability of the world order. Kings proudly carved their victories and treaties in stone. Merchants eagerly invested in long sea voyages. People believed that their world would endure for generations. No one imagined that in just a few short years, everything would be reduced to ashes. Mighty fortresses would burn, trade routes would be cut. The sounds of joyous celebrations would be replaced by cries of despair. And so, as we read the last letters from Ugaritor, stand among the ruins of Mycenae, good Hattusa, today we see more than broken stones and crumbling walls. We feel a deep and abiding sadness for a world that once glowed with confidence and life, now reduced to a faint echo of a bygone era. Amidst this magnificent landscape, the first undercurrents began to stir, not through a great war, but through words carved into stone, like a faint warning from the past. The earliest written evidence of sea peoples from a famous stone monument, Merneptah Stele, or the Victory Bier of Merneptah, built around 1207 BC in Egypt. At that time, Pharaoh Merneptah, son of Ramesses II, faced with increasing threats on both Egypt's western and eastern borders. Among the inscriptions celebrating his victories, along with records of his exploits against the Lebu and Meshu tribes to the west, a seemingly small detail appears, but it opens the door to one of the greatest mysteries of ancient history. The inscription reads, "Canaan has been plundered. Ashkelon has been captured. Gezer has been taken. Yanoam no longer exists, and Israel is devastated. Its seed is no more. And Sherd and Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh, those who came from the sea, have been defeated, no longer a threat to the land of Egypt." These names, Sherd and Shekelesh, Ekwesh, Luka, and Teresh, will later become important clues as we trace the path of sea peoples. What is striking is how these groups are described, coming from the sea, a phrase that is both specific and shrouded in mystery. No previous Egyptian records mention these peoples. They did not belong to the traditional powers with which Egypt was accustomed to dealing. Modern scholars believe that these may have been migratory groups or warrior confederations that first appeared on the historical stage just as climate and social upheaval were increasing. The fact that these unknown groups of maritime origin are mentioned in an official inscription as Bia Merneptah shows that conflicts with them were important enough to be included in the annals of history, a sign of the presence of sea peoples. This was no small event. Moreover, the simultaneous mention of the destruction of Canaanite cities in the same passage suggests that these seafaring groups were not only clashing with Egypt, but were also impacting the wider Mediterranean region, where fragile trade systems and political alliances were already under pressure. From these few lines alone, we can sense a new wave of unrest rising, one that even the mighty pharaohs could not ignore. And this was only the beginning. In the years to come, these groups would not limit themselves to coastal raids. They would organize into large migratory forces, carrying their families, women, children, and possessions, pushing deep into the fertile lands and reshaping the entire political and economic landscape of the region for the next century. What is engraved on Bia Merneptah still resonates with us through time. A world that once seemed unshakable is on the brink of its greatest upheaval. If the above lines Bia Merneptah hiss, the first warning of the presence of sea peoples, then, less than 3 decades later, the entire Egyptian world would face the full force of the storm they unleashed. Around 1175 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, Egypt entered one of the most decisive battles in its history. A battle that we can clearly visualize today thanks to the detailed reliefs carved on the walls of the temple, Medina Habu in Thebes. The images, more than 3,000 years old, are as sharp and vivid as if they had been carved yesterday. And in them, we see clearly a huge force coming from the sea, carrying not only warriors but also migrant communities, women, children, carts laden with possessions, as if they were looking not only to plunder, but also to occupy new land for yourself. According to the engravings of Ramesses III Alliance Sea Peoples, this includes several groups: Peleset Jeker, Shekelesh, Dinyen, and Weshesh, names that are still the subject of much scholarly debate today. The reliefs show well-equipped sea fleets with large ships with oars and broad sails. Their warriors wore helmet with horns or special cone, carry round shield, and use strange weapon clear evidence that they were not disorganized raiders, but a force well prepared for large-scale warfare. Ramesses III anticipated this confrontation. He placed ambushes along the coast and deployed Egyptian warships on the Nile's branches and estuaries, strategic choke points that sea peoples would have to pass through to advance inland. When the battle began, the ships of sea peoples were trapped in shallow water, where they became easy targets for Egyptian archers and infantry. In the inscriptions, Ramesses III boasts of a resounding victory. Those who came from the sea, I threw them back into the sea. They were scattered on the sand. There was no one left to carry news home. Behind these triumphant words, however, lies an undeniable truth. This is no small raid. It is a mass migration, desperation, a clash between Egypt and a large wave of refugees seeking settlement rather than mere looting. Furthermore, although Ramesses III declared victory, Egypt was far from intact. Egyptian territories in the Levant were lost forever. Egypt's international power was greatly diminished, and its domestic economy suffered greatly. This was only part of a much larger picture. While Egypt managed to maintain stability, many other kingdoms were not so fortunate. The tide of the sea continued to sweep across the Mediterranean, leaving behind burned cities and shattered civilizations. When we look at the reliefs in Medina Habu today, we see more than just battle scenes. We witness a pivotal moment in history, where an old world is beginning to fade and a new order, unstable and chaotic, is rising from the ashes. When historians study the surviving records from Bia Merneptah, from the reliefs in Medina Habuan, from various other scattered textual sources, they have identified a list of names closely related to sea peoples. They include Shurden Shekelesh, Peleset, Cheker, Denyen, and Luka. Names both strange and haunting, each raising unanswered questions. The most notable are no text written by the sea peoples themselves has ever been found. Everything we know about them comes from the records of those who fought them, primarily the Egyptians, a civilization with a meticulous record-keeping tradition. Shurden often depicted as elite warriors with horned helmets and armor. Some scholars suggest a connection with Sardinia, but the evidence is lacking. The origin of Shurden remains a mystery. Shekelesh evokes Sicily, but that's just linguistic speculation, Sut. Perhaps the group with the clearest historical trace, many historians agree, they are the ancestors of the Philistine who later settled along the coast of Canaan, founding cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod. Archaeological evidence shows a new culture with distinct Aegean influences. Checking. Also settled in the Levant, but original homeland is unknown. The Denyen, perhaps most controversially, some scholars associate them with Denai, ancient Greek term for the Mycenaeans. If correct, it suggests that in sea peoples. There are Greek groups, but this is still hypothetical, close often associated with the Lycia region of Anatolia, which had a history of seafaring and piracy. The common thread among all these names is this: we don't know where they actually came from. No ancient maps record their kingdom. Shurdenor territory of the Denyen. No city claims to be the original home of Slip, and no chronicles written by these groups have ever been found. This makes sea peoples became a particularly elusive phenomenon. Were they independent groups united by chance or an organized alliance? To this day, historians still have no definitive answer. It is this ambiguity that ensures that the story of sea peoples will forever carry an unsolved mystery, a piece of history truly hidden at the heart of the ancient world. But perhaps the thing that left the strongest impression about sea peoples, both to the ancient civilizations they encountered and to us today, are not only their mysterious names but also featured warrior image of them preserved in reliefs, most notably on the walls of Medinet Habu Temple. As you pass through the temple's colonnades, vivid battle scenes come to life. Egyptian soldiers facing off against strange warriors from the sea whose forms are markedly different from their traditional enemies. The most striking feature Ishit of them. Many warriors are depicted wearing helmets with two sharp horns, or sometimes a wide-brimmed hat with a high top, a design not seen in the military traditions of Egypt or its neighbors. These helmets were not only functional, but also seemed to have a symbolic meaning, perhaps indicating power or a distinct cultural identity. This detail has sparked decades of debate. In addition, we see them wearing ground shields, some convex, some flat often, with a metal knob in the middle, designed to deflect blows or be used offensively in close combat. This type of shield was common in the Aegean and Anatolian world, but was relatively unknown to Egyptian soldiers. In terms of weapons warriors, sea peoples wielded double-edged sword, big dagger, and sometimes spear launcher. In particular, some reliefs depict them with swords, leaf sword, a design very similar to weapons found at archaeological sites, Mycenae, further strengthening the theory of a potential link between sea peoples and Aegean cultures. Their clothing was also striking. Many warriors were depicted wearing fringe skirt, with bare feet or light footwear, allowing for flexible movement ideal for fighting on ships or making quick coastal landings. Taken together, these factors created an image of warriors that was both foreign and formidable. To the Egyptians, who were familiar with the weapons and tactics of their traditional enemies, sea people, had to appear both alien and extremely threatening. It was this difference that reinforced the sense that they came from distant lands carrying with them a distinct military tradition not yet fully integrated with the Mediterranean coastal cultures of the time. To this day, archaeologists continue to compare the warrior image of sea people with artifacts found in Sardinia, Sicily, Lycia, and Mycenaean Greece. However, no definitive conclusions have been drawn. Every detail remains a scattered piece of a portrait that is still waiting to be completed. When we look at the reliefs in Medina Habuand, the lines of Merneptah, one thing becomes clear. Sea peoples. They were not mere ghosts passing through history. They were a force powerful enough to be immortalized on Egyptian stone, and numerous enough to cause one of history's greatest crises. Late Bronze Age. But who were they really? This is a question that has kept historians debating for more than a century. Two main theories have emerged. Were they simply pirate crewbold, or are they part of a larger, organized migration, helped throw the entire Mediterranean into chaos? The first theory about piracy stems from the way Egyptian texts describe the earliest encounters with sea, people's quick attacks, surprise raids along the coast, looting, and quick retreats. These tactics fit the style of organized piracy, which was already common. However, if they were just pirates, why do the reliefs depict women, children, and entire groups of migrants? And why in the major attack under the Ramesses III C, with boats carrying carts loaded with possessions, livestock, and tents, clear signs of migration rather than simple raids? This detail opens the door to the second theory, supported by many modern scholars, that sea peoples represents an organized wave of migration born of profound upheavals throughout the ancient world. Climate crisis, prolonged drought, devastating earthquakes, and the collapse of trade networks transformed once prosperous lands into harsh, unsustainable environments. In this context, groups from heavily affected areas, perhaps from Anatolia, the Aegean, or even further west, were forced to leave their homelands, taking their entire communities with them in search of new settlements. Such migrations, when met with resistance from established civilizations, could easily turn violent degenerating into war and plunder. And this could be how have carved their names into history, not simply as pirates, but as desperate communities determined to fight for their future. Yet, the question remains, Sipa may not fit neatly into any one category. They may be a combination of many different groups. Some are pirates, some are migrants, some are professional fighters, some are refugees. It is this diversity and complexity that makes Sea People becomes elusive and fascinating to anyone fascinated by the deeper mysteries of ancient history. Debates about the true nature of Sea Peoples may continue, but the consequences they leave behind are undeniable, and the city Ugarit is perhaps the most vivid testament to their impact. Located on the northern coast of the Levant in present-day Syria, Ugaritans was one of the largest commercial centers of Bronze Age. From here, Ugarit's merchant ships sailed across the Mediterranean, trading copper, tin, cedarwood, colored glass, fine textiles, and countless other luxury goods. The city was not only wealthy but also remarkably advanced, being the place Ugaritic alphabet, one of the earliest writing systems known to mankind, was invented. The royal palace of Ugarit was vast, containing hundreds of clay tablets, recording trade transactions, diplomatic treaties, and royal letters. But all that changed in an instant. The last letter of King Ugarit, apparently reflecting the city's growing panic as the enemy believed to be Sea Peoples surrounded, and then Ugarit disappears from history. Modern excavations at the site Ras Shamra, where Ugarit was once located, reveals ashes and destruction covered the entire city. The walls were in ruins, the bricks and stones were blackened by fire. The clay tablets were broken or melted by the extremely high temperatures. The most remarkable thing was that there is no evidence that Ugarit was ever rebuilt. The once thriving city was left abandoned forever after the attack. Archaeologists also found many unfinished clay tablets in kilns, a sign that the attack was so sudden. Some diplomatic letters were found lying on writing desks never sent. All this speaks to the enormity of the destruction that Ugarit suffered. With the fall of Ugarit, a vital link in the Mediterranean trade network was severed, and when that link collapsed, the entire interdependent economy of the region was shaken. Today, when we look at the charred walls of Ugarit and the fragments of the clay tablets that remain, we cannot help but feel a profound loss. A rich, civilized, and creative center was instantly erased from the course of history, as if it had never existed. And Ugarit, just one of many victims of the wave Sea Peoples, a wave that continues to surge across the Mediterranean world. If the collapse of Ugarit reveal the destructive power that Sea Peoples could cause for coastal commercial centers, the story of Hattusa, the mighty capital of Hittite Empire, opens an even more haunting and mysterious chapter. Deep in the highlands, Anatolia Hattusa, the heart of one of the world's greatest superpowers, Bronze Age. The Hittite Empire not only controlled vast territories, but was also Egypt's main rival. The city Hattusa built with massive stone walls, carved gates, and magnificent royal palaces. In its archives, archaeologists have unearthed more than 30,000 clay tablets that record every aspect of Hittite life. And then, around 1200 to 1190 BC, Hattusa was suddenly abandoned. Archaeological excavations reveal signs of widespread destruction and fire throughout the city. But here's the mystery. There is no direct evidence that the Sea Peoples attacked Hattusa. At least no Egyptian records mention such an attack. However, the timing is too coincidental to ignore. The Hattus abandonment occurs precisely during the period C. Peoples were sweeping across the Mediterranean as the international system of alliances and trade collapsed around them. Some scholars suggest that after devastating coastal centers, Sea Peoples could have been indirectly causing internal instability in the already weakened Hittite Empire. an empire reeling from climate crisis drought and conflict with mountain tribes. The final royal letters from the Hittite archives have a desperate tone filled with pleas for help that are eerily similar to the final letters from Ugarit. What is certain is Hattusa was never rebuilt. After being abandoned, Hittite empire disappeared from the map of history, giving way to an era of chaos. What really happened in the last days of Hattusa? Whether Sea Peoples directly hit the city, or did their wider impact push the empire into an irreversible crisis? No one can say for sure. But the timing, combined with evidence of broken trade links and a widespread wave of collapse, suggests that the shadow of sea certainly covered the end of Hattusa, whether by force or consequence. When Hattusa lying dormant in the ashes, the wave of crisis did not stop in Anatolia. It swept west across the Aegean Sea and struck at the very heart of the Mycenaean world, the Greek civilization of Bronze Age. Mycenaean civilization famous for cities like Mycenae. Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes were among the Aegean's greatest commercial and military powers, their fortified palaces imposing cyclopean walls and treasure troves of royal tombs reveal a society that was both prosperous and sophisticated. The Mycenaean system of government centered around large palace complexes. Their trade routes spanned the Mediterranean, with goods being exchanged with Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. And then, in the late 13th to early 12th centuries BC, one by one, the Mycenaean cities began to collapse. At Mycenae, excavations revealed thick layers of ash covering architectural remains, clear signs of a fierce citywide fire. Pylos also suffered the same fate. Administrative tablets at Nestor's palace, hardened by the fire, recorded orders to mobilize the defenses and prepare the ships, suggesting that the attack was swift. At Tiryns, one of the strongest Mycenaean fortresses, we find ruined walls and burned buildings. The entire palace system, once the backbone of Mycenaean power, collapsed in just a few decades. Most notably, no sign of lasting recovery at these sites. The Mycenaean civilization, which relied on its complex palace network, failed to recover. Some scholars argue that this destruction may have been due to internal unrest. But when we compare the timing of the sea campaigns across the Levant, Egypt, and look at Mycenaean royal records regarding naval defense, many believe that Sea Peoples likely played a major role in the collapse, either directly or indirectly. Furthermore, following this destruction, the entire Mycenaean world entered a period of profound decline. Linear, B. Scriptus by the ruling class disappeared. International trade collapsed. City-states fragmented, retreating into smaller, isolated communities. It was from this vacuum that the so-called the Dark Ages of Greece began, a period that would last for centuries until the Greek world rose again. While the Mycenaean civilization faded across the Aegean to the east, in the lands Canaan Sea Peoples left even more lasting marks than the physical destruction. Profound demographic and cultural changes whose traces can still be seen today. Canaan, stretching from the southern coast of the Levant, was once a prosperous region. Its cities, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, Gath, flourished as bustling commercial centers. The Canaanites built a rich culture, trading extensively with Egypt, the Hittites, and Mycenae. But by the late 13th century BC, archaeological evidence suggests a powerful wave of change had swept through the region. Most notable among these Sea People settle here Islip, a group that modern scholars almost unanimously identify as ancestors of the Philistines famous in later history. The reliefs in Medina Habu describe Slip was one of the main forces in the attack of Sea Peoples into Egypt. But unlike some other groups, Slip were not completely destroyed. Some of them, after their defeat in Egypt, established permanent settlements along the coastal regions of Canaan. Excavations at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza reveal a new settlement that appeared suddenly around 1200 BC, coinciding perfectly with the migrations of Sea Peoples. It is noteworthy that the material culture of this new class was markedly different from that of the native Canaanites. The style of pottery reflected a late Mycenaean or Aegean tradition. The architectural forms, burial customs, and even dietary habits all pointed to a new seafaring population. From this group would emerge the people later known in the Hebrew Bible as the Philistine, the main opponents of the Israelite tribes. The settlement of Canaan not only changed the regional balance of power, but also reshaped the demographic map of the Levant. The Canaanites did not disappear, but in many coastal areas they were replaced or gradually assimilated by these new settlers. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Canaanites, Philistine, rapidly built a strong economy, restored trade networks, and developed a unique cultural identity that blended their deep maritime roots with local influences. This reveals an important aspect of the migrations of sea peoples. They were not only agents of destruction, but also builders. Some groups chose to settle, adapt, and contribute to the cultural fabric of the lands they visited, leaving traces that would last for millennia. And so, while the Mycenaean cities collapsed, while Hattusa and Ugarit lay in ruins, a new chapter was unfolding in Canaan, a chapter in which sea peoples threw slip wrote from their very presence on land. But perhaps the most profound consequence of the destructive wave of sea peoples, it was not cities left in flames, but the collapse of a network that once connected the entire ancient world. Complex trading system of the Bronze Age now shattered beyond repair. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, civilizations across the Mediterranean had built a young global economy, in which vast maritime and overland trade routes linked Egypt, Hittite, Mycenae, Ugarit, Canaan, Cyprus, Anatolia, and even beyond. Copper and tin. The lifeblood of the Bronze Age flowed through this system, along with cedarwood gold, silver, ivory, precious stones, fine textiles, wine, olive oil, and countless other rare goods. Merchandising ships laden with goods once weaved the Mediterranean like shuttles, weaving a vast economic network that kept the complex palace economies running smoothly. But within a few decades, that network collapsed completely. Coastal trade routes were blockaded or severed by the fleets of sea peoples. The port cities were once prosperous. As Ugarit was reduced to rubble, the port Byblos decline. Alatia, modern-day Cyprus, a key supplier of copper, was attacked and fell into chaos. As the trading fleets disappeared, the flow of copper and tin, essential for the production of weapons and tools, stopped. This caused a domino effect. Without bronze, the palace economies collapsed, unable to maintain military power or maintain their elite structures, clay tablets from Ugarit and piles. It is revealed that even as destruction loomed, city officials desperately attempted to organize convoys, request aid, and mobilize navies. But all to no avail. The trade routes had become too unstable. From that point on, the ancient world slid rapidly from order to chaos. International alliances disintegrated. Diplomatic treaties once etched in stone, as eternal promises became meaningless when the partners no longer existed or lacked the strength to fulfill their obligations. The palace-based economic system could not survive without trade. Palaces collapsed, nobles lost power, artisans lost their jobs, citizens were forced to return to subsistence. Streets that had once bustled with commerce fell silent. Warehouses that had once been filled with goods were empty. Docks that had once echoed with the voices of merchants were reduced to crumbling walls and lonely, weathered mooring posts. For this reason, many historians describe this collapse as one of the earliest examples of failure of globalization. A world that had once been deeply connected and seemingly stable proved surprisingly fragile in the face of sudden upheaval. And when the dust settled, the Mediterranean world as it had come to be known was no more. A new order, fragmented, localized, uncertain, rose in its place, ushering in a dark age from which humanity would take centuries to recover. in an effort to shed light on the true nature of sea peoples. A major theory that has attracted considerable attention from modern scholars was a wave of sea people related to groups migrating from Balkan, especially the tribes. Dorian moving south during that period of crisis. This theory is based on a series of observations from both archaeology and modern genetic studies. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries, BC waves of migration from the northern Balkans began moving south. Archaeological evidence suggests that many settlements in the Danube Valley and throughout the Balkans underwent major upheavals, possibly due to severe climatic changes, population pressure, or internal conflict. Among them was the group that would later be known as the Dorian. The appearance of people Dorian in southern Greece coincided closely with the fall of the Mycenaean cities. This has led some scholars to question whether part of the Dorian or other Balkan groups joining forces with sea peoples, helping to fuel a heavily armed migration across the Mediterranean. Archaeological clues offer intriguing hints. New post-collapse settlement layers in the Peloponnese show abrupt changes in architecture, burial customs, and pottery styles reflecting a culture distinct from the earlier Mycenaean tradition. Similarly, along the Levantine coast, certain types of pottery and building techniques appear to have characteristics associated with the Balkans or northern Greece. Research. Ancient DNA have added new tools to this investigation. Scientists are now analyzing ancient remains from Greece, the Balkans, and the Levant. Preliminary results suggest that during the transition after the collapse of Bronze Age, there is an increase in genetic markers associated with Balkan populations in southern Greece and in some Levant coastal communities. This raises the possibility that Balkan migrant groups not only entered southern Greece, but that some may have joined the seaborne migrations, becoming part of the Wave Sea people, profoundly reshaped the region. However, this theory also has its objections. People Dorian, according to tradition, the latter re-established power in southern Greece, rather than disappearing. C. Sea peoples is a very diverse alliance. Assigning the Balkans a dominant role risks simplifying a complex phenomenon that includes groups from Anatolia, the Aegean, the Levant, and beyond. Nevertheless, this theory adds an important dimension to our understanding, reminding us that the phenomenon, sea, it was not a simple linear event, but the result of many overlapping migrations interacting in complex ways. After considering various theories, many modern scholars have come to what is perhaps the most realistic conclusion. The Sea Peoples were not a single, unified people, nor were they a fixed, permanent alliance. They are likely to be one temporary alliance formed from many different groups, each with its own motives, all caught up in the swirling crisis of the times. This theory is supported by some compelling observations. From Egyptian records, Sea people. Listed is a very diverse set of groups: Sherden, Shekelesh, Peleset, Jeker, Dinyan, Luka. Neither group has a clear homeland, and their military traditions, clothing, and weapons are very different. This raises the question, if Sea peoples as a unified country, why are their descriptions so drastically different? The most reasonable answer is, Sea peoples is likely to be a loose alliance formed amid larger regional collapses. In a world where extreme climate change, widespread crop failures, earthquakes, devastated cities, international trade was disrupted, and great empires weakened and lost control, countless groups, from displaced farmers, unemployed soldiers, and pirates to desperate migrant bands, could have coalesced to form mobile, mixed populations. In the process, loose alliances between these groups likely arose out of pure necessity. Those with superior strength or naval experience would lead, while others joined in search of new land wealth or simply survival. This explains why in major campaigns, Sea peoples not only carrying warriors but also women, children, livestock, and carts full of goods. They were not simply pirates, but armed migrant groups with the ultimate goal of resettlement. Archaeological evidence from the Levant also shows the cultural footprint of sea peoples. Very inconsistent, supporting the idea that they were the product of many peoples, and migratory forces converging amid chaos. And perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this theory is that it reflects the truly tumultuous nature of the era. As the old world order collapsed and the palace systems could no longer protect their populations, people were forced to move. In an age of chaos, military power became a vital means of survival. Thus, from a collection of disparate groups, an alliance sea peoples, a loose coalition emerged, part fighting force, part refugee wave seeking a place to survive. Such a coalition could have disintegrated upon arrival in new lands, or evolved as circumstances changed, which helps explain why their historical traces appear so fragmented and elusive. For this reason, many scholars today consider the idea of a temporary hybrid alliance to be the most plausible and suitable explanation, and also why the mystery of sea will continue to resist any simple final answer. Among all the theories surrounding the rise of sea peoples, perhaps the most appealing theory is the one that focuses on climate crisis because it provides insight not only into the sea people, but also of a world that was cracking at its very foundations. Modern climate studies, combining ice core analysis, tree ring data, lake sediment records, and pollen evidence, show that in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, the Mediterranean and the Near East experienced a period of prolonged and severe drought. These drought cycles could last from 50 to 150 years, profoundly affecting rain-dependent agricultural systems. In this context, societies that had relied on trade networks and centralized palace economies began to destabilize. As food became scarce, prices skyrocketed, public unrest increased, and the lower classes of society were pushed to the brink of despair. With few options left, many groups were forced to abandon their homelands, joining a wave of mass migration. However, migrating across a world where much of the old political order had collapsed, and where the remaining fertile lands were now concentrated in coastal cities or scattered river valleys, conflict was inevitable. Moreover, in such an unstable world, isolated migratory groups could not easily fend for themselves. As a result, many chose to join forces, form armed alliances capable of both protecting its members and seizing resources when necessary. And so, from desperate farming communities, unemployed soldiers, and displaced nomadic peoples, the alliances known as sea peoples began to form. According to this view, the sea peoples are not the initial cause of collapse, but a direct consequence of the deepening climate and social crisis. Yet, as these migratory groups moved across the region, their very presence accelerated the collapse that was already underway. Cities were destroyed, trade routes were cut, and farmers were driven from their fields, creating a spiraling cycle of violence and displacement. The archaeological evidence strongly supports this explanation. Layers of destruction in cities, such as Ugarit Mycenae and Pylos, coincides closely with known periods of prolonged drought. Many scholars today believe that the combination of climate crisis and violent migration is likely the most powerful driving force behind the phenomenon. Sea peoples, a world that has relied on climate stability and commercial prosperity, stripped of those foundations, cannot help but fall into waves of violence and migration. And in this spiral, sea people is not pure villains or mere victims, but the most obvious symbols of a disintegrating era. But the deeper you dig into the story of sea peoples, we come to the greatest wall of uncertainty in the whole mystery. We don't really know where they come from. On thousands of clay tablets, countless reliefs, and written records of ancient civilizations, there is not a single line that explicitly states the homeland of the sea peoples. No country is named. No king calls himself King of Sherdengood Slip. No maps from that period mark the territories of these groups. Why is this? Part of the reason lies in the very nature of the surviving historical sources, which come mainly from Egypt. those who fought against sea peoples. Egypt was one of the few great civilizations to survive the storm, and the Egyptians had a very special way of recording history. Every inscription, every stele, every relief was intended to honoring the pharaoh's victory, to reinforce the image of eternal royal power. In that style of writing, enemies were always portrayed as barbarians, stateless, lawless, as waves of chaos crashing into the order maintained by the pharaoh. Even the way sea people, listed in Egyptian texts, also reflect this approach. Group names are given vague descriptions such as from the sea or from foreign lands, without clear geographical references. This may reflect genuine Egyptian ignorance of origins, but it may also be a deliberate propaganda concealing the enemy's identity, while exaggerating the pharaoh's power. Furthermore, the pharaoh himself, sea peoples. They are not centralized empires with advanced administrative systems. They are loose confederations of diverse groups, many of whom are migrants, climate refugees, or displaced communities. In essence, they are no writing system, no temples to record history, no royal chronicles. What remains of them comes only through the records of those who opposed them, and as every historian knows, history is written by the victors. Almost everything we know about sea peoples today has come and gone. Egyptian prism. A biased lens created for political purposes, and sometimes tends to exaggerate the pharaoh's achievements. Additionally, many regions that sea peoples may have originated, the Anatolian coast, the Aegean, the Western Islands, themselves devastated in the fall of the Bronze Age. Many cities were burned and never rebuilt, and old writing traditions disappeared. Potential direct historical sources from the homeland of sea people simply no longer exists. It was a combination of Egypt's bias in historical recording and the absence of records from the sea people, which has left us with an almost impenetrable gap in our understanding. And so, although sea peoples truly shook the entire Mediterranean world of that time, they remain, and may forever remain, ghosts in human memory. A strange wave from the past, whose echoes we can still hear, but whose true form we will probably never fully see. While the original homeland of sea peoples remains an unsolved mystery, their post-collapse journey has left clearer traces on the map of history. One of the most prominent examples is the rise of Philistine, a group that archaeological evidence shows was directly related to one of the key armies of sea peoples. As we have seen in the reliefs in Medina Habu, Slip played a major role in the attack of sea peoples into Egypt. After defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, a part of the forces Slip did not return to the sea. Instead, they settled along the coastal regions of Canaan. It was here, through a gradual process of adaptation and integration, distinctive Philistine culture emerged, a culture that would shape the political and cultural landscape of the Levant for centuries to come. Archaeological excavations of cities such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gathas provided clear evidence of this transformation. At Ashkelon, archaeological layers reveal a new settlement layer that emerged around 1200 BC, the exact period C. Sea peoples known to have arrived. In particular, archaeologists have found a large amount of artifacts, late Mycenaean pottery, a type of pottery common in the Aegean but rare in Canaan. Before this period suggests that the newcomers brought their cultural traditions with them from the sea. At Gaza, architecture and burial customs also indicate the presence of a community with customs markedly different from those of the native Canaanites. What is particularly fascinating is how the people Philistine still retains many elements from the original Aegean culture in their everyday objects, architecture, and rituals. However, over time they integrated into the new environment, creating a unique hybrid culture, combines deep maritime influences with strong local traditions. This evolution is particularly evident at places such as Ashkelon and Ekron, where pottery, Philistin later developed a distinct style. From a genetic perspective analysis, modern DNA has further revealed that the population's Philistine initially carries genetic markers consistent with Western Mediterranean origin, reinforcing the theory that part of the Sea Peoples, namely, slip, has played a fundamental role in this community. Thus, from what began as a wave of violent migration, Sea Peoples, or at least some groups of them, transformed into stable communities that left a lasting mark on history. Philistine would become a significant force in the Levant, frequently clashing with Israelite tribes and contributing to the complex political and cultural landscape of the region. In this way, while most groups Sea People sother or disintegrated or assimilated the story of the people, Philistine shows us that Sea Peoples, not only do they destroy, they also create. And this is perhaps one of the clearest examples of how deep crises can create entirely new orders from the ruins of the old. And so, after tracing every footprint, every layer of ash, and every remaining fragment, we can begin to understand why Sea People have become one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. Not because they never existed. On the contrary, their impact is clearly visible in the layers of archaeology in the ruins of ruined cities and lost civilizations. Not because there are no records. Egyptian inscriptions, material layers in Canaan, the Levant, and the Aegean all tell pieces of their story. But perhaps this is what makes the mystery so compelling. The more evidence we uncover, the more we realize that what we know is just the tip of a huge iceberg. First of all, the origins of the Sea Peoples remain elusive. For more than a century, scholars have attempted to trace the roots of each group. Peliset, Philistine, Sheridan, Sardinia, Shekelesh, Sicily, Deniense, Mycenae, Danawi, Chequer, Luca, Anatolia. But no theory is strong enough to gain universal consensus. Even in Egyptian records, Sea People is always described as waves of invaders from the sea, from foreign lands, with no nation, no known king, no recorded capital. This makes them one of the most elusive, mysterious enemies that ancient civilizations ever faced. Second, the Sea Peoples left no written history of their own. There is no chronicle of Sea Peoples, no proud stelae, recount their victories from their perspective. No surviving texts tell their story in their own voices. Everything we know comes from the other side. From Egyptian records, from scattered archaeological traces, from the ruins of the civilizations they attacked and then disappeared. This ensures that their image will forever be half seen, half unknown. We cannot say for sure how powerful they were, how numerous they were, how organized they were, or even whether they were a single coordinated force, or multiple waves of migration overlapping one another. Third, while the impact of Sea Peoples is undeniable, their material legacy is difficult to trace. They have helped cause or hasten the collapse of many civilizations. Bronze Age Hittite, Mycenae, Ugarit. But after the wave passed, most groups, Sea Peoples either assimilated into local societies or faded from memory. They left behind layers of ashes, early ceramic styles showing Aegean influence, but no lasting new civilization to bear their name. Their story is like a great wave crashing into history, leaving deep scars, but the wave itself dissipated before anyone could fully record it. And perhaps it is this elusiveness that makes Sea Peoples becomes endlessly fascinating. We have no shortage of stories about mighty empires with palaces and written chronicles. But the story of Sea Peoples is the story about the outsiders to official history. Desperate, determined communities whose voices were never preserved but who nevertheless reshaped the course of an era. And in that very ambiguity, sea peoples will likely continue to challenge the imagination and patience of scholars and of all of us for centuries to come. But perhaps in the whole journey of learning about sea peoples, the deepest question is not who they are, but history has or has not remembered them as such. Because without the Egyptian inscriptions, we might never have known that a wave sea peoples hook the ancient world. Almost everything we know about them comes from Egyptian records, from Merneptah, from the carvings in the temple, Medina Habu Under, the time Ramesses. It is from these engravings that the names Pelisat, Sherden, Shekelesh, Cheker, Denyen, look preserved. It is from these reliefs that we see images of warriors with horned helmets and round shields, and of migrating families, women, children, livestock in tow, moving as part of this great upheaval. Without these records, all the archaeological evidence, the layers of ash at Ugarit, Mycenae, Pylos, the new settler classes in Canaan, will remain isolated clues difficult to piece together into a coherent picture of such a vast wave of armed migration. And yet, this also reminds us of an essential truth. History is written by the victors. It was Egypt, one of the few great civilizations to survive the storm of sea peoples, recorded this story through his own lens. In the inscriptions, the pharaoh is always the victorious hero. See. Patbas were the defeated, barbarian invaders. There was no voice from the government. Sea peoples. There is no record of their story seen through the eyes of those forced to leave their homeland, cross the sea in desperation, and fight for survival. This is what makes the story of sea people both fascinating and sobering, because what remains in the historical record is always only one side of a much larger story. If one day a chronicle of sea peoples were such a chronicle ever discovered, assuming that such a chronicle had ever been written, the story we know today might be very different. But perhaps such a chronicle does not exist. Sea peoples, by their very nature, are migrant communities without strong administrative structures, without permanent systems of record. And in that sense, they are one of the lost voices in history. This is also a larger lesson. How many events, how many peoples, how many stories shook the ancient world? But because no one recorded them from their side, we will never know they existed. Sea peoples, fortunately or unfortunately, left enough traces on Egyptian rocks for us to follow their story today. But surely, many other sea peoples throughout human history have been swallowed up in utter silence, leaving nothing but layers of earth and rock. And perhaps this is what makes the mystery of sea peoples endlessly fascinating, because it is not just their story, but also the story of how history is recorded, how human memories are preserved, and how many voices have been forgotten along the way. And as our journey reaches the final lines of the story of sea peoples, perhaps an even bigger question remains in mind. Without the Egyptian inscriptions, we might never have known that sea peoples ever existed. So how many other chapters of human history? How many communities? How many civilizations? How many stories have been completely erased from human memory? The layers of earth that we excavate today reveal only the tiniest fragments of the past. The written records that remain are the voices of a few civilizations that have managed to preserve their history. Behind every carved stone, every broken piece of pottery, every inscription carved into a temple wall lies a vast ocean of the unknown and perhaps the unknowable. And this is why the journey of historical discovery never really ends. Because history is not only what we know, but also what has been forgotten, buried, or never recorded. Sea peoples provide one of the most vivid examples of this, an anonymous wave that reshaped the political, economic, and cultural map of the entire Mediterranean, but whose identity has largely faded into the sands of time. But they were not the only ones. If C. Peoples. If the stories that shook an era, and we still don't know who they really were, how many others have been lost entirely, leaving no trace in the written records we have, perhaps somewhere in a faraway land beneath unexcavated layers of earth, clues still lie hidden, fragments that could forever change the way we understand the past.